Alright guys, today I'm replacing the power steering pump, alternator, and tensioner pulley on my 2006 Toyota Land Cruiser. Let's get started on the job. The first thing I'm doing is disconnecting the battery because we're working with the alternator. These are both 10mm nuts, and actually you only need to disconnect the negative terminal, which is the black one I'm removing here. I torque both of these to about 66 inch-pounds for reference. Next, I'll remove the engine cover. We have two 10mm nuts and two 10mm bolts. The torque specs for both of those are also 66 inch-pounds. We'll need to access some of the pulleys from under the Land Cruiser, so I'm removing these 7 12mm bolts. The torque is 21 foot-pounds on those guys. 4 clips to loosen this top part of the airbox, and you have two 10mm bolts here. Those are both very low torque, just 44 inch-pounds. Remove these 3 pressure hoses. Sometimes they get stuck and you can just use a flathead to help pry those off. Removing the mass airflow sensor, and now with the 10mm socket I'm loosening the final clasp. You can get some leverage on the airbox and you should be able to twist that right off the intake manifold. Also, one quick note, this intake manifold is very dirty and in need of cleaning. You can see all the carbon buildup there. And the other thing is, it looks like the PCV valve is about ready to be changed as well. You can see all of the dirt and oil built up around that. To remove the drive belt, I have a 14mm socket on my wrench, and you'll see I'm moving to the left in order to detension the belt. Once you have enough tension relieved, you should be able to pull the belt over that number 2 pulley where I am there. And you'll see that black bar that I have, that's actually the handle to my floor jack that I've slipped over the wrench to give me a little bit more leverage. And just make sure that you have enough space to get your wrench over that fan fluid coupling when it comes back. So if you start at about 1 o'clock, you should have enough space to slip that over. There are 2 routes you can go at this point. The FSM route, which is what I'm doing here, involves removing the fan shroud, the fan and fluid coupling along with the radiator reservoir, and this opens up a lot of space to make it a lot easier to reach the pulleys. According to the forums, this step isn't necessary and you should be able to directly remove all of the pulleys. The trade-off is you're going to have a lot less space to work with, and removing the pulleys and reinstalling them might be a bit more of a hassle. I'm not going to lie, this was kind of a headache to take all of this off, but hopefully you can follow along and figure out which direction you want to go. First, I'll remove the AC discharge line from the fan shroud. These are all 10mm nuts with a pretty low torque, just 44 inch-pounds. Next, I'll remove the radiator reservoir. These are two 12mm bolts. The torque on those guys is 71 inch-pounds. One little retaining clip, and that'll slide right out. And then underneath that, there's another 12mm bolt, which is the fan shroud connecting to the radiator. One more bolt that I forgot here, and we're ready to remove the fluid coupling. There are 4 12mm nuts that we need to remove, and I'll leave a link in the description on how to remove these without using a special tool. Also note you'll need a crowfoot wrench in order to torque these back to spec at the end, so just keep that in mind. I left this in to show my mess up a little bit. You'll need to remove all of the bolts holding those tubes along the top. If you don't do that, there's just not enough room to take the fan shroud out from the top. I also drained out a little bit of coolant and removed this hose along the top just to get a little extra room to remove the fan shroud and fluid coupling. In the FSM, those two come out together, just like I'm removing them here. Once you finally have that out, now you'll have plenty of space to work with and remove those pulleys. The power steering pump needs to come out first, so I'm getting rid of as much of the power steering fluid as I can before removing any of the hoses. And only one hose needs to come off. This larger one here goes from the reservoir down into the power steering pump. I'm using a pair of hose clamp pliers that I have. Regular pliers will work as well, these just make it a little bit easier. With the clamp removed, now I'm taking that hose off of the reservoir, and I would recommend having a cup and rag ready. There'll definitely be a little bit of fluid left. At this point, I'm ready to remove the pump, and here's a quick look at that before I get started. With my impact wrench and a 17mm socket, I'm loosening the union bolt or banjo bolt here. Watch out, there will definitely be a little bit of fluid left. I just put my cup underneath that to catch everything. And then I'm slowly letting the rest of the power steering fluid run into the cup before finally removing the bolt entirely. There's a quick look at the union bolt removed, and now you'll be able to see the washer that sits between the bolt and the power steering pump. What I'm knocking right here is intended to sit against the power steering pump when you're tightening this all back up at the end. One more look at those washers. Those are attached to each other from the factory. Now we're ready to remove the power steering pump. This is definitely the easiest part. So we just have 3 14mm bolts, these long guys that need to come out. And again, I'm just using the end of my floor jack to put on top of my wrench to turn it into kind of a breaker bar. That seemed to work really well. And again, this part is pretty easy because I did all of the annoying removal of that fan shroud and everything. So with those 3 bolts removed, now the pump is ready to come out. You'll still have a little bit of fluid inside of it, so just be careful as you're pulling that up. It will definitely be inclined to spill a little bit. And here it is.
Right.
So a quick look at that. I was definitely pretty stoked to get that out of the Land Cruiser. Okay, so the power steering pump is done. Now we're moving on to the alternator. These guys are all 14mm as well. Same drill, using my wrench with the extension on it, and I'm just going to loosen each of those guys. I think this was the only one of the pulleys that I had to reach from the bottom of the Land Cruiser, but they're all pretty easy to get to. And so on the alternator, I think you have 2 nuts and you have 1 bolt that goes through that. So there's a look at one of the nuts, and switching the camera view so you can get a better look at this. So at this point I'm underneath the Land Cruiser, breaking that last bolt. With those out, we just need to remove this little cap, and I found the best way is just to slide my screwdriver underneath it, and then it'll pop off with a little pressure. And then there's a little copper nut that's holding this harness onto the alternator. That should come off pretty easily. The torque spec on that is 7 foot-pounds. And with that off, there's just one more harness that you need to remove on the backside of the alternator. I would just pull it out a little bit and let it hang there on those bolts. I took it all the way off and had a little trouble removing it, but no big deal. Once that's off, you can take the alternator out, and here's a quick look now with the power steering pump removed, the alternator's out, and the last thing I'm going to tackle is the tensioner pulley. I'm showing you this sequentially in the order that I did it, and first I'm removing the 2 nuts and bolt that hold the tensioner pulley down. I actually didn't realize that the timing belt covers need to come off, and I'll show you that in just a second. So here's the first nut that I removed, and then again using my breaker bar, removing that second nut. With those off, I'm removing now the single bolt that goes through the bottom of the tensioner pulley. And now I need to remove the timing belt covers. I didn't do the best job filming this, so I'll use the diagram to help point these things out. So first, I'm removing the number 2 timing belt cover. This is just a small cover to the upper right of the pulley. And then after that, I need to remove the larger number 3 timing belt cover, and that has just several small bolts and 1 nut that hold that to cover the timing belt. So I skipped over the bolt removal, and here's how it looks once that cover is off of the timing belt. A little dust there. And now with all of those bolts removed, I'm pulling the tensioner pulley away from the engine block, and that little cover is going to come along with it as I pull away. Now I can completely remove the tensioner pulley, and then I'll start the reinstall process. My approach was to take the new tensioner pulley and get it situated over the bolts, and then grab the smaller timing belt cover, and that actually hooks into the tensioner pulley in a particular way. It was a little bit finicky to get on. So let me freeze frame this and show a quick diagram. This is from the FSM as well. So you have a notch here that goes on the tensioner pulley and a notch above that goes over the timing belt. Those are both obvious when you're holding the cover, but a little bit hard to show on video. So here's the final product. I've now put the pulley in, it has the smaller cover on, and now I'm slipping the larger cover back into place. The torque on all of these is pretty low. It's a 66 inch-pounds, so basically hand tight. The tensioner pulley itself has one long bolt and two nuts on it. Those are all 12 millimeter and torqued to 12 foot-pounds. Moving on to the alternator, I'm reconnecting the wiring harness here and then slipping the alternator just over those fixed bolts. Now I'm reinstalling the alternator wire. This nut is 10 millimeters and the torque on that is 7 foot-pounds. Once that's all snugged up, we need to reinstall the little plastic cap covering that, and that should just click right into place. Next, I'll snug up the alternator. There are two nuts and one bolt. Those are all 14 millimeters, and you can see the torque specs for that on the screen. Last, reinstalling the power steering pump. So my approach was to take the 3 long bolts and pass them through the power steering pump so that I could orient it and then start screwing that top bolt in so that it could just kind of hang there before snugging all of those guys up. These are all 14 millimeters and the torque is 13 foot-pounds. Moving on to the union bolt now. So I'm sliding that new washer over. That's the new union bolt and screwing that into place. This is 17 millimeters and the torque is 37 foot-pounds. I bought a new return hose as well as new clips. These are pretty nice to install. So you're just going to grab on the top and yank that red tab off. And just like that, it's fixed into place. I'm doing the same thing here, reconnecting the return hose to the power steering pump reservoir. Here's another shot of removing the clip.
Oh God, that's great.
I'm speeding through this part here just so you can see it, but basically taking the fan shroud along with the fan and fluid coupling and maneuvering that underneath the AC lines and putting it back into place. It was a lot easier to put this back on than it was to get out, that's for sure, but definitely not my favorite thing to do at the end of installing everything else. And the final step is refilling the power steering fluid. Also note that at this point I've reinstalled the drive belt, the airbox, and the engine undercover. So first, jack up the Land Cruiser. You don't need to start it, and you're going to fill the power steering fluid reservoir up to its hot max, or maybe a little bit more. Don't worry if you added too much fluid at this point, you'll be able to extract that if for some reason you did. So with the Land Cruiser jacked up and turned off, I'm just turning the wheel all the way lock to lock left to right about 3 to 5 times. So we're just doing this to help the fluid settle and get some of the air out of the system. This is a fast forwarded view. You can see the fluid rising and falling. Next, lower the Land Cruiser and you can go ahead and turn it on. And again, you're gonna go slowly lock to lock to help get the rest of the air bubbles out. You can actually hear my power steering pump making some noise here. In this view, you're able to see some of the air leaving, and you wanna repeat this left to right procedure until all of these air bubbles go away. So you can actually hear, as I'm turning the wheel, some of the air coming out of the system. And you'll know that you're kind of complete with this step once no more air is coming out of the fluid. And you shouldn't see any air bubbles in the fluid either. It'll just be completely still and flat. Keep an eye on the levels here. I actually needed to add a little bit more fluid to the system. I used less than 1 total quart to do this. Go ahead and put that top back on and you're ready to take it for a test drive. Hope you guys found this video helpful. If you have any tips or tricks for other folks, please leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.